All right, so we're going to try this where Jake's giving video introductions to our Sunday school class on the weeks that I'm not there. I'm hoping it works. Frank's supposed to be able to get it on his iPad. He and I are going to work on that after I send this to you. So here's what I plan on doing. I'm going to spend about 5, maybe 10 minutes maximum kind of talking through some kind of organizing ideas. And then I have put on the table or in the office some sheets of paper with some discussion questions and a Bible passage that I want you to read. And so for today, I want us thinking about Paul as he's introduced in the Bible. So if you know your New Testament, you know that you begin with the Gospels. And part of the reason we're doing Paul is because Foster gave you that really interesting course back in January about the 4 Gospels. Now in Acts, we move from the 12 disciples that Jesus had when he walked around Galilee and up to Jerusalem. We move from those disciples to the Apostle Paul. He becomes the major important character in Acts. And Acts kind of shapes the way we read the entirety of Paul's letters. And so I'll say all this again next time I see you, but what I want us thinking about is those letters as chronological movements through Paul's life, so we get kind of an insight into the man himself. Who was this apostle to the Gentiles? And so what I want to do today in this brief video is to give you some ways of thinking about what Paul's context was. And then you're going to go and you're going to read Acts, part of Acts when we first get introduced to him. And then you'll have some discussion questions, talk about that. And then there's the last discussion question says, what questions do we need to send to Jake so he can come and talk about them in the next video? So that's the plan for today. I've got this map as our background because I want to help us see Paul as a living, breathing human being at a specific time and place. So we are talking the 1st century. I mean, this is within 20 to 30 years of Jesus' death and resurrection is when Paul starts writing his first letters. So his letters, the letter in 1 Thessalonians, that's the earliest text we think that we have in the New Testament. It even predates the Gospels. Most of Paul's letters were finished by the time the Gospels were written. So Paul is out there sharing the gospel. And I've put this map here because I just want you to see he makes it all the way from what we now think of as Israel and Palestine all the way to Rome. He even goes further beyond Rome, but all we have evidence-wise in the New Testament is he's on his way to Rome and he makes it there. He's planning, as we will find out, to go all the way to Spain. But this is a time and place when they didn't have trains, they didn't have cars, they were having to use boats, and there are portions of Acts where they talk about having to weather in place for months because the winds weren't favorable. So I want us thinking about how Paul, as a human being at this point in history, had to do certain things. He had to, painstakingly write. They didn't have paper in the way that we have paper. They didn't have printing presses. Like, he had to write something, and if he were going to send copies to somebody else, he, or what's called his amanuensis, so sometimes we hear about Timothy, so that's the person who would take his dictation down. Those people had to make actual physical copies to then send it out. They didn't even have those old carbon copies that I bet some of you are familiar with. So it takes time to do what he had to do. And he goes on at least 3 missionary journeys that we can find in Acts. And that's what this map is. It's just to let us know the guy was traveling all over the place. And I think that's really cool. And it helps kind of give insight into him as a person, because we're not just thinking about him as a man sitting in a room, yelling at the television, which is, how we can think about him if we read some of his diatribes against his opponents out of context. So that leads me to my first major point that I want you to think about as you are thinking about Paul. The Paul we think we know is one we've received. Whether you love him or you hate him, this class that we're going to do between now and into May, we're going to try to look at what he and his contemporaries tell about him. So not what we learned from Martin Luther, not what we learned from our mid-20th century people who told us that Paul was a jerk. We're going to try to get into the letters, get into what Acts shows us about Paul, and really kind of grapple with who he was as a human being. Which again, that's why I want us thinking about those big journeys that he had to take. Why he's writing those letters while he's like on a boat, or while he's sitting next to a fire before he gets bitten by a snake. Like all those are stories from Acts. Like, so that's when he's writing, and he's writing letters in the midst of doing ministry. He wasn't a college professor who was writing textbooks. He was a pastor going from church to church and then writing letters back to his other churches. So that's really important to know. So for the rest of this talk, I want to focus a little bit on what happened in, like, what Paul's worlds were like what was going on culturally. Because we live in the United States of America, which feels pretty homogenous. Like, I moved from Spokane, Washington to Florence, and it feels roughly the same. Yes, the South is different than the Northwest. For instance, we have more people in church than they do. We have a nicer accent than they have, things like that. But by and large, the culture feels the same. That was not the case as Paul was going around doing ministry. So he had three different kind of interlocking worlds that were really shaping the way he saw the world. And I'm taking some of this from this, it's not that new, but it's a book by N.T. Wright called Paul and the Faithfulness of God. It's his kind of big, huge book as he's finishing up thinking about the New Testament. He started it way back in the 1990s. There are 5 volumes of it. So I've been reading this in preparation for this study. So a lot of what I'm going to tell you today comes from that book. So Wright helps us think about these kind of interlocking worlds of Paul. The first is his Jewish context. So he is a devout Jew. He's proud of this. He says this on multiple occasions. But also, he wasn't just kind of wandering around this kind of Jewish enclave in Jerusalem. He was out and about. He was from Tarsus. So he knew when he was growing up Greeks and Romans. He himself was a Roman citizen, so he knew the Greco-Roman philosophical and religious world. He also knew the Greco-Roman political and cultural world, the kind of empire, the emperor worship that was all around the empire at the time. But people didn't just speak like one language. Most of the places that most of the Roman citizens would have spoken Greek, but then they would have been multilingual. So Paul was reading Hebrew. He was speaking Aramaic. He could speak Greek. He could probably speak Latin, right? So he's out doing all these things because there are all these cultures mixing together in this part of the world. So some big things happen when Paul's kind of these three interlocking worlds come into contact with Paul's encounter with the resurrected Jesus. And so that's what I want to do is I just want to look at each one of these three, think about some kind of major points about them, and then how Paul kind of adjusts to them after he encounters Jesus, the resurrected Christ. So our first one is Paul's Jewish world. So many of you know some about Judaism. I mean, there's monotheism, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Very big for the Jewish contemporaries of Paul was that the temple, the second temple, so the first temple was destroyed in the Old Testament. You read about that in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, and the aftermath of that when they get sent into exile. And then in Ezra, Nehemiah, they build a new temple. That's the second temple. And that's a few hundred years before Jesus is born, before Paul. And Jews at the time are very conscious that when Solomon built the first temple, God's presence descended. And that hasn't happened yet in the second temple. So they are waiting for the temple to be filled with God's presence. In Jesus, Paul starts to think, oh, the temple isn't as important as we thought it was. Jesus is the temple, and the people who are baptized into Jesus are the temple. So Paul begins to see the temple differently. This is one of those radical revisions of Judaism that Paul ends up doing, as the temple as a place becomes less important. The people of the Messiah, Jesus, are what's important. And of course, Judaism after the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, it also makes a similar move, and the synagogues become very important. For the practicing and devout Jew in the first century, they would have cared an awful lot about the law, the Torah, the teaching of Moses. You would have had to be circumcised. You would have needed to keep certain kosher laws, because those kept you isolated from the surrounding Greco-Roman culture, which was an idolatrous place. Paul Paul starts to think, oh, if the Messiah has come and the nations, the Gentiles, have been gathered in, that means we need to rethink these things. So the law has been fulfilled in Jesus, Paul starts to think. And you're going to meet a radically different Paul when you look at Acts. But Jesus has come and fulfilled the law, which now means that those boundaries, those legal things that kept the Jewish people separate from the nations, now get de-emphasized, which doesn't mean that he gets rid of them totally, but he does de-emphasize them. He starts to put a focus on baptism, this kind of turning away. We have it in our liturgy to this day, this turning away from worldly power to God's power, to the Messiah, to Jesus. And then he has to work out how, if Jesus was raised from the dead, how does he relate to the one God of Israel? And so those are questions that Paul begins to ask. He has to rethink his Jewish faith, but Paul never stops being Jewish. He thinks he is being the most devout of Jewish people. And that's why he has all these arguments in Romans and places about how the law is fulfilled and how it still has some kind of force, but what kind of force does it have? And it's because he's having an intra-Jewish argument. And that's really important for us now to think about. Is we like to think of like Judaism and Christianity as two separate faiths, but we actually arose out of one sect of Judaism that existed in the first century. There were a lot floating around, and Christianity was one argument within that one sect. And Paul went one way, and the rabbis went a different way, and we grew up. But we're actually siblings. In a real way, Christians have as much a claim back to the Old Testament as our Jewish brothers and sisters. Now, they might say differently, but that's the claim Paul is making on behalf of Gentile Christians. So he starts to rethink his Jewish faith, but he doesn't get rid of it. He thinks that what he's doing is actually remaining faithful to the Old Testament and to God's promises to Israel in particular. So we'll explore that more in future weeks. But it's very important to think about how this connects with his philosophical and the religious context that's floating around him. Because it would have been tempting for him to say, okay, we're not going to be Jewish anymore, so we're going to go be more like those philosophers or more like those religious pagans. That's how a Jewish person would have thought about the Greco-Roman gods. And so he actually doesn't have to change much about how a Jewish person would have thought about Greco-Roman religions and philosophies. They would have just seen that, Plato, as a philosopher, he was close, but he didn't quite get there. Aristotle, he was close, but he didn't quite get there. They can learn from them and argue about them, but they don't quite get to what Jewish philosophy, Christian theology get to about God. And when it comes to the gods themselves, Paul stays exactly the party line that the Jewish people were walking at the time he was around. Those gods and goddesses were not at all gods and goddesses. They were demons. And they don't mean by demons exactly what we mean by demons, but it's close enough. They think that they are actual powers that have power within the created world, but that power has no claim on God. And so what they're trying to say is these are demonic forces that are actually harmful to people. So there are a lot of them. Remember that the Israelites, the Jewish people, thought of one God, but there were these kind of lesser forces floating around. But Paul remained Jewish here. He thought worshiping those demons was worshiping something less than the Creator. And actually worse than that, it was less even than humans, because humans bear the image of God, not stones and statues. And you catch that in Isaiah and in Jeremiah in the Old Testament. And what that means is that if you start worshiping that kind of entity, it dehumanizes you. And Paul is very clear, not only is he saying faithful as a Jew as he's kind of grappling with these religions and going out into this empire where they are. So he doesn't just stay in Jerusalem or Alexandria where Jews kind of are. He goes out into places where it's just Gentile territory. Maybe there are some synagogues, but he's in what you might think of as hostile territory, places where Jewish people are in the minority, and there definitely aren't any Christians yet because Paul hasn't spread the gospel. So he has to go out and he says, look, you think you're wise. You have these ideas about what makes somebody intelligent. But what we know is that Jesus crucified tells us what the world is actually like. And so here he's challenging the philosophy of that day and age, which thought that strength and power were most important. And that means we can now go to our third and final bit of information. So when it comes to the political world, thinking about that notion of might and power, there was this narrative floating around that Augustus Caesar, when he took over the throne after Julius Caesar, that the end of history had come. Now we finally had an emperor who was going to hold peace. There was going to be the Pax Romana, and he was basically a god in flesh. And so that meant he was all powerful. There were emperor cults, and there have been arguments about this in the past, but there were emperor cults, and they really thought of him as something like a deity. And so he would have something like ultimate authority, and he had all the power. Now, of course, if that's what you think power is, the cross is foolishness. And so Paul basically looks at that world and says, no, a new kingdom has arrived. And that kingdom means that Caesar might think he is king, but God is the ultimate authority. And we see what God is like in Jesus' cross and in his resurrection. The end of history didn't end when Augustus Caesar took the throne. It ended when Jesus was crucified and raised again. And that showed us that there is a new history. And what that means is that anyone made in the image of God is a human being. So slaves, women, and children. The Romans did not think any of those people were humans. They were horrible to all of them. And so when you get a letter like Philemon, in the New Testament with Paul writing about a slave, there is another letter at the time written by a Roman aristocrat who has a very different take than the one that Paul has in that letter, and we can talk about that when we get there in a few weeks. So those are the kind of three worlds I just wanted to introduce you to, like Paul's Jewish background. He remains devoutly Jewish, but he has to grapple with the fact that the Messiah has come and is not like what he expected. He could have, in theory, gone and been more like a philosophy in the Greco-Roman world, or even like a Greco-Roman religion where he's like, well, we add this other God in. And Paul was like, nope, that's not an option. I have to stay Jewish. How do I stay Jewish since Jesus has been raised from the dead? And if Jesus has been raised from the dead, that vindicates the God of Israel, which now puts challenges against the empire of Rome. And so that's the kind of stuff that's flowing into this person who's, growing up in the first century, learning his Greek and learning his Hebrew and reading his philosophy, reading his Jewish scriptures, and then having to walk out into the marketplace. And then he's a man we know from Acts who can wander around and talk to people radically unlike him. And he really angers some of them, but he angers them because he says that, that isn't a God, that's a demon. And of course that would make you mad if that was your God. So again, thinking about Paul as a human in a particular context, who has to get on boats, go across the Mediterranean Sea, who has to write painstakingly. I mean, they didn't even have fountain pens back then. So they're having to etch into hides of animals. So just thinking about his kind of material place. All right, I have given you so much information. I've been trying to talk slow. I am going to trust that Patty will tell me next week that I talked too fast. If I talked too fast, I've tried to talk slower. And then hopefully this worked. So I want to leave you with one last thing. So I want you to think for the next however many minutes you have about how Paul is introduced in Scripture. I think it'd be great if you open up the Bibles. They're on the bookcase, just on the left side of the library, the red ones at the top shelf. If you just opened up to Acts 7, you're going to see Paul. He's introduced as Saul, which is probably his Jewish name, and Paul would have been a Greek name that he had, which would have been normal at the time. And then you can go read his conversion account. You don't have to read all of it, but it would be really good if you kind of read it and thought about, what are we seeing here? And then I've put those questions on the table for you to ask. And this was a first go. You can give me feedback, and I'll adjust as we go through the next couple of weeks together. On the weeks that I'm not there, I will record a video like this. All right, I look forward to seeing you all soon. I'll talk to you later.